Under the quiet pulse of New York at midnight, the city glowed through a curtain of rain. Inside the high-glass penthouse, Alexander Ward knelt before the window, the skyline reflecting like ghosts across the marble floor. His shirt clung to his back, half unbuttoned, his tie hanging loose around his neck. In his trembling hand, a torn photograph, two brothers smiling at a summer lake, one alive, one gone. The billionaire's lips moved, but the words cracked like a prayer to no one. "We're alone now. Time to tell the truth." His voice was hoarse, low-soaked with whiskey and grief. The words were not meant for anyone to hear yet. From the hallway, Sophie Carter froze. She had come only to collect the trash, her last task before clocking out. But when she saw him like that, knees bent, eyes lost the air thick with loneliness, she forgot to breathe. She had seen him every week for months, silent and distant, a man who lived among glass and rules. But tonight he looked nothing like the man from the magazines. He looked human, broken. Sophie stepped closer, the soft squeak of her shoes swallowed by the sound of the rain. Alexander's body jerked, his breath quickened, chest rising in shallow bursts. The glass of whiskey fell from his hand, shattering across the marble. He pressed a hand to his chest, as if his ribs were collapsing inward, his eyes wild, unfocused. A panic attack, violent and sudden. "Alexander," she whispered, unsure if she had the right to speak his name. He didn't answer. His fingers dug into his shirt, gasping as if the air itself refused to enter his lungs. Sophie's training as a maid told her to step back, to call for help, to never cross the invisible line between service and intimacy. But the trembling man before her wasn't a billionaire anymore. He was a person drowning in silence. Without thinking, she rushed forward, kneeling beside him. "Hey, you're safe," she said softly, her voice trembling. "Breathe with me, okay? In through your nose, out through your mouth." She guided him like she once did for her mother, her hand hovering near his shoulder, careful not to touch, unless he allowed it. His body trembled, then stilled. His gaze met hers, the storm in his eyes reflecting the city behind her. He blinked rapidly, tears unshed but glimmering. "Who are you?" he asked, barely audible. "Sophie," she murmured. "Just Sophie." He looked at her as though the name itself carried warmth. The room smelled of alcohol and rain. The air was thick with unspoken things, shame, exhaustion, humanity. Sophie gently took the photo from his shaking hand and placed it on the table, smoothing its torn edge. "You're safe," she repeated, quieter this time, like a promise. He swallowed hard, still catching his breath. "He used to say that too," Alexander whispered. "My brother." Before the words cut off his throat, tightening. His head fell forward, resting briefly against her shoulder. For a moment she froze, not because of fear, but because she could feel the weight of everything he carried, regret, loss, the unbearable truth. "It's okay," she said again. "You're not alone right now." He gave a strangled laugh, one that wasn't really laughter at all. "You don't understand," he rasped. "Everyone leaves when they see who I really am." She pulled back just enough to look at him. Then maybe they never really looked. The storm outside roared. Lightning flashed against the skyline, illuminating the wet streaks on his cheeks. For a heartbeat, the world felt suspended, two strangers surrounded by glass, and pain sharing something too fragile to name. Then Alexander's breathing steadied. He sat back against the wall, running a hand through his damp hair. "Thank you," he said hoarsely, ashamed of needing anyone. Sophie nodded, gathering the shards of the broken glass, but her hands were shaking. Before she turned away, he whispered again, quieter, almost to himself. "We're alone now. Time to tell the truth." Her heart stopped. She wanted to ask what truth he meant, but his eyes had drifted shut. The empty bottle rolled across the floor and came to rest at her feet. Sophie watched him for a long moment, unsure whether to feel pity or something deeper. The city lights flickered against his face, painting him in gold and gray. Half man, half memory. She exhaled slowly, realizing she had just seen the part of him no one else was allowed to see. As she pulled the blanket from the sofa and draped it over his shoulders, he murmured something in his sleep. A name. Ethan. She didn't know it yet, but that name would be the key to everything. She turned toward the window where the rain kept falling, washing the city clean. Then the screen faded to black. 6 months earlier, morning light crept through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse, scattering reflections across the polished glass and steel. The city outside was already alive, a hum of sirens and horns and ambition, but inside silence ruled. Alexander Ward sat at the edge of his bed, head-bowed, fingers pressed to his temples. The scent of whiskey lingered faintly from the night before, though the glass was gone, cleaned by invisible hands that worked while he slept. His breath was steady now, his mind cold and sharp again. Whatever storm had seized him in the dark hours had passed, leaving only a hollow ache where panic used to live. He adjusted the cufflinks on his shirt, the same pair he wore every day. Since the funeral engraved with the initials E.W., Ethan Ward, his brother. The memory of his voice was something Alexander avoided, yet it haunted him in the quiet between meetings and deals. The apartment was immaculate, like a museum no one visited. Every object had a purpose, every purpose was control. At precisely 9, a soft chime from the smart security system announced the arrival of the cleaning staff. He didn't need to look to know who it was. Tuesdays were always the same. Sophie Carter. He had never asked for her name directly. He'd read it once on the small badge clipped to her uniform. She entered quietly, her presence as unobtrusive as the whisper of cloth against marble. No perfume, no noise, no trace. She moved like someone who had learned to exist without taking up space. He watched her reflection in the window while pretending to read an email. Her motions were efficient, but careful, deliberate, without being mechanical. There was something soothing about it, the way she folded. The throw blanket arranged, the cushions wiped the counters with circular movements. It reminded him of the way Ethan used to clean his camera lenses, slow-focused, almost reverent. Alexander turned away from the window. "The glass streaks," he said, suddenly, voice calm but cold. She froze, cloth in hand. "Sorry, sir. I'll redo it." He didn't answer, just stared at the city again. In truth, there were no streaks. He just wanted to hear her voice again, something human to cut through the sterile air. She continued her work without complaint, the faint sound of fabric against glass echoing like a heartbeat. When she passed behind him, he caught a faint trace of soap and lemon. Simple, clean, honest. He found himself wondering what her face looked like when she smiled. But then he stopped, irritated at his own curiosity. Curiosity led to attachment, and attachment led to pain. He'd learned that the hard way. Sophie kept her gaze low as always. She had heard the stories everyone in the building had. The ruthless billionaire who fired executives with a single sentence. The man who built empires from ashes and then burned them again just to see if he still could. Yet standing a few feet from him, She didn't see power. She saw exhaustion carved into the line of his shoulders. She saw loneliness in the half-finished meals she threw away each week. She saw grief in the way every surface gleamed, as if polished to erase fingerprints that no longer existed. When she finished dusting the shelves, her eyes fell on a framed photograph, the same one she had seen the night before, now restored and standing upright again. Two brothers in their 20s, sunlight behind them, one holding a camera, the other squinting at the light. She could tell which one was Alexander. Even back then, his smile didn't quite reach his eyes. She placed the frame carefully where it had been, not daring to linger. "You've been here long enough," he said quietly, not looking up from his tablet. "Yes, sir," she replied. She gathered her supplies, her movements silent. But before she reached the door, his voice stopped her again. "Why don't you ever look at me?" The question hung in the air, heavier than glass. Sophie turned slightly, her fingers tightening around the handle of her cleaning cart. "Because people like me aren't supposed to." It wasn't defiance, just truth, plain soft and devastating. Alexander stared at her reflection again. "And what kind of people are you, Miss Carter?" "The kind who can be replaced," she said simply. He wanted to tell her she was wrong, but the words caught in his throat. He had replaced so many people in his life that he no longer remembered their names. Secretaries, assistants, friends, even lovers. All gone, all easy to erase. But for some reason he knew that if Sophie disappeared, her silence would echo louder than her presence ever did. When she left, the penthouse returned to its perfect stillness. Alexander sat for a long time, staring at the faint outline her footsteps had left on the polished floor before the light shifted and swallowed them whole. That night he poured another drink, the ice clinking against the glass. Outside, the city roared, a million lives colliding. Inside, his world stayed motionless, somewhere between the hum of traffic and the soft thud of his heartbeat. He thought he heard her voice again. "Because people like me aren't supposed to." The words wouldn't leave him. For the first time in years, Alexander Ward wondered what kind of man he had become and whether anyone could still look at him and see a person. He closed his eyes, the ghost of his brother's laughter echoing faintly in the back of his mind, and the silence of the penthouse deepened, waiting for something to break it. It was a Tuesday evening when Sophie found him differently than usual. Alexander Ward wasn't behind his desk or lost in numbers. He sat on the floor near the massive glass wall that overlooked the city. His back rested against the cold window sleeves, rolled up, the top buttons of his shirt undone. In his hand was the same photograph, two brothers frozen in time, smiling like nothing could touch them. She hesitated in the doorway, unsure whether to speak. He didn't notice her at first. The glow of the city lights washed over him, throwing reflections across his face, softening the sharpness that usually defined him. He was the only one who saw me as a person. Alexander said suddenly, not looking at her. The statement wasn't directed to anyone, but the weight in his voice drew her in. She stepped closer quietly, setting down her cleaning supplies. "Your brother?" she asked, her tone careful. He nodded once, eyes still fixed on the photograph. "Ethan." He believed there was more to me than ambition. "More than this," he said, gesturing vaguely at the skyline that surrounded them. He was wrong. His voice cracked on the last word. Sophie said nothing, but her eyes softened. She saw a man who had spent too long in silence, trapped inside a tower made of success and regret. When he finally looked up, Their eyes met for the first time. It was a short, fragile moment, yet something shifted. The room didn't feel so vast anymore. She noticed how tired he looked, the dark circles under his eyes, the slight tremor in his hand when he tried to put the picture down. "Would you like some water, sir?" she asked gently. He hesitated, then nodded. She returned a minute later, placing the glass beside him. As she did, their reflections merged briefly in the glass, two figures blurred by light and shadow. Neither spoke. He picked up the water and took a slow sip, the tremor fading. "You don't have to stay," he murmured. "You've already done your job." "Maybe I'm not finished," she said softly. Her reply surprised both of them. He glanced up, something almost like curiosity flickering behind his guarded eyes. "You're not like the others," he said quietly. "They avoid looking at me. You don't." She shrugged lightly. "Maybe I just don't scare as easily." That earned her the faintest hint of a smile, brief, broken, but real. "Ethan would have liked you," he said. He was always surrounded by people who didn't want anything from him. He made everything feel less hollow. Was he younger 5 years? He was the good one, the kind one. He stopped, his throat tightening. "He died in a car accident. My car." Sophie froze. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I should know." He said quickly, "You should stay." The vulnerability in his tone startled her. For a man like him to ask anyone to stay was an admission of something deep and dangerous. She sat down slowly, not beside him but nearby, leaving space between them. Outside, the glass reflected their silhouettes, two people divided by the light of a city that would never know this moment existed. "Do you ever feel," he said quietly, "that your life became something you never agreed to?" Sophie looked at him for a long time before answering. "Every day." Her honesty disarmed him. "I was supposed to be an artist." She continued, eyes distant. "But my mom got sick. Bills don't wait for dreams. And now you clean penthouses for people who don't notice you." "I notice the view," she said softly, glancing out at the skyline. "Sometimes that's enough." He studied her face, not beautiful in the polished way of models or socialites, but real, grounded, illuminated by something he couldn't define. "You talk like my brother did," he said finally. "Maybe he'd still be here if I'd listened more." "Or maybe you wouldn't be here if you hadn't lost him," she replied quietly. The truth of it hit him harder than he expected. Silence fell again, but it wasn't empty. It was heavy, intimate, and strangely peaceful. The city lights shimmered through the glass painting lines of gold and silver across their faces. Two worlds, his world of glass, hers of grit, overlapping just enough to remind them they were both still alive. Sophie stood after a while, brushing invisible dust from her skirt. "You should rest, Mr. Ward." He nodded, not trusting himself to speak. As she turned to leave, he said, "Thank you." She paused in the doorway, her reflection caught in the window beside his. "For what? For seeing me?" She gave a faint smile, small, genuine, fleeting. "Good night, Alexander." His name sounded different from her lips, softer, human. When she was gone, he sat there staring at the faint marks her shoes had left. On the floor, fading slowly into the darkness, outside the glass walls reflected only one figure now. But for the first time in years, he didn't feel entirely alone. The night it happened wasn't planned. Sophie had come later than usual, delayed by a subway breakdown and a rainstorm that soaked the city in silver. When she arrived, Alexander was still in his office upstairs, the glow from his computer reflecting off the glass walls. She moved quietly as always, gathering the dishes from the counter and wiping away the traces of another meal he hadn't finished. The apartment smelled faintly of rain and whiskey, a scent that had become as familiar to her as soap and lemon. She was reaching for the last glass when a sudden sound made her freeze. The sharp clink of crystal tipping over. She turned and saw Alexander at the dining table, a spill of dark liquid spreading like an ink stain across the marble. His expression was distant, somewhere between anger and exhaustion. "I'm sorry," he muttered, though it wasn't clear whether to her or to the memory that haunted him. Without hesitation, Sophie crossed the room, her steps soft on the tile. She grabbed a towel kneeling beside the table to blot the mess before it reached the edge. "I'll take care of it," she said quietly. He leaned back, watching her in silence, his shirt sleeves rolled to his elbows, his tie hanging loose. The image was almost domestic, almost. "You don't have to," he said. "It's my job," she replied, wringing the towel into a bowl. He looked at her for a moment longer, something unreadable in his eyes. "You can sit for a moment, if you want." The words caught her off guard. No employer had ever said that to her. She hesitated, unsure whether it was an invitation or a test. "It's fine," she said softly, standing up, but he nodded toward the empty chair. "Please, just a few minutes. I don't want to eat alone tonight." His honesty disarmed her. Against every instinct she sat. The rain outside intensified, drumming softly against the glass, wrapping the world in a kind of solitude that made confession feel safer. Alexander poured water into 2 glasses, pushing one toward her. "Do you always clean in silence?" he asked. "It's easier that way," she said. "People don't like hearing from the help. And what if I do?" She gave him a small, guarded smile. "Then you'd be the first." He studied her, as though trying to understand something about himself. "You're different," he said finally. "Most people who come here look at me like I'm an idea, not a person." "You don't. Maybe because I don't see a billionaire," she said quietly. "I see someone who's tired." He laughed under his breath, surprised by how accurate that was. "You're not wrong." She tilted her head slightly. "You work late. You don't eat much. And that photograph?" She stopped herself. "You noticed," he said. "You put it back the next day. It looked important." "It is." He paused. "He was my brother. Ethan." The name filled the air between them. "He died 2 years ago. Everyone said time would dull it, but they lied. I still hear him sometimes, still see him when I close my eyes." Sophie's voice softened. "You miss him more than I know how to say." He looked at his glass, the reflection of his face, broken by ripples in the water. "We built this company together. He was the heart, I was the head. When he was gone, I tried to keep it alive. But I turned it into something he wouldn't recognize." "You were trying to survive," she said. "Sometimes survival looks ugly." He nodded slowly. "And you, what were you before this?" She hesitated. "A student. Art school. I left when my mom got sick." "You paint used to. Now I clean." Her tone wasn't bitter, just factual, like someone who had accepted her place in the world long ago. Alexander leaned forward. "Why not paint again?" "Because dreams cost rent," she said, smiling faintly. "And art doesn't pay for medicine." Her words hung heavy in the quiet. He looked at her, seeing not the uniform, not the badge, but the quiet resilience that defined her. "If you could paint one thing right now," he asked, "what would it be?" She thought for a moment, eyes drifting toward the window. "The sky," she said finally. "Not how it looks, but how it feels, endless, heavy, beautiful, and sad." He swallowed hard. "That's exactly what grief feels like." They sat in silence for a while, listening to the rain, the hum of the city fading beneath it. Sophie looked around the penthouse, all glass metal perfection, and realized it was beautiful but airless, like a cage made of wealth. "You know," she said softly, "for a place so expensive, it's awfully quiet." "Silence is easy," he said. "It doesn't ask questions. It also doesn't answer any," she murmured. He smiled a real smile, this time faint but genuine. "You're dangerous, Sophie. How's that?" "You make me think." The clock on the wall ticked past midnight. The rain eased. For a long moment, neither moved. The lamplight wrapped the room in warmth, glinting on the glass of water between them. Their reflections met faintly in the surface blurred, but close like two colors bleeding together. Sophie finally stood, smoothing her apron. "You should sleep," she said softly. "You should paint," he replied. She paused, then smiled, small, almost invisible. "Maybe someday." "Good night, Sophie." "Good night, Alexander." When she left, he remained at the table, staring at the two untouched glasses. The city outside glimmered with wet light, alive and unreachable. For the first time in years, Alexander Ward didn't feel like drinking. He just sat there tracing the condensation on the glass she'd touched, wondering when silence had started to feel like company. The morning the story broke, Alexander woke to the sound of his phone, buzzing relentlessly on the nightstand. Dozens of notifications flooded the screen, messages from the board, emails from PR, news alerts flashing red. His name filled the headlines, each one sharper than the last. The billionaire and his maid. He stared at the words in disbelief, his stomach tightening. It wasn't just the photo. It was the way it looked, intimate, private. Sophie sitting at his table, her reflection caught in the lamplight, his gaze fixed on her with something that couldn't be explained away. The internet didn't need facts, it needed fire. Within hours, the story spread like smoke. Hashtags, memes, think pieces about inappropriate workplace relationships and abuse of power. Investors panicked. The company's stock trembled. The press waited outside his building, microphones ready. Alexander felt the world tilt under his feet. In the boardroom, the faces around him were pale and tight. "You've compromised," the brand said. Harris, the head of PR, voice clipped. "We need to release a statement immediately." "There's nothing to release," Alexander said coldly. "Nothing happened." "Then prove it," another executive snapped. "Fire her. File a suit if necessary. Distance yourself before this gets worse." The suggestion sliced through him. He saw their hungry eyes, the unspoken judgment, a man too human to be powerful. "She hasn't done anything wrong," he said quietly. "Then you have," Harris replied, "and perception doesn't care about truth." The meeting dissolved into chaos. Every voice wanted a solution, but all they wanted was a scapegoat. Alexander barely heard them. All he could see was Sophie's face. Calm, kind, unaware of the storm she was now at the center of. When he left the office, his assistant ran to him breathless. "She's been terminated," she said. "The cleaning service dropped her contract. They said they couldn't handle the attention." His chest tightened. "What, it's already on record. I'm sorry, sir." The words blurred. Terminated. Fired. Because of him. Because he hadn't been careful enough. Because he'd let her exist too close to his truth. He didn't wait for the elevator. He took the stairs two at a time, his pulse hammering. Outside flashes exploded, cameras, voices, questions like bullets. "Mr. Ward, are you dating your maid? Did she blackmail you? Is this why your brother's charity shut down?" He pushed through them, climbed into his car, and slammed the door. The driver looked back nervously. "Where to, sir, find her?" Alexander said. The driver hesitated. "I don't know where, just drive." The city blurred past gray and merciless. He called every contact he could think of, the cleaning company, HMR, anyone. No one knew where she'd gone. Some hung up as soon as they heard his voice. By evening the rain returned, hammering against the windshield like punishment. He parked outside her last known address, a small brick apartment building in Queens. The windows were dark. He tried the buzzer, no answer. He left a message, his voice low and unsteady. "Sophie, it's Alexander. Please call me back. I need to explain. You didn't do anything wrong." The voicemail beeped. Silence. He waited in the car for hours, watching the lights of passing trains flicker through the mist. Each time a figure appeared at the corner, his heart leapt and fell again when it wasn't her. When the rain turned to mist, he finally drove home. The penthouse was colder than he remembered. Her absence hung in the air, sharper than any accusation. The towel she'd folded last night was still on the counter, her small handwriting still visible on the note she'd left beside it. "See you next week." He sat in the dark, reading it over and over, until the letters blurred. For the first time in his life, Alexander Ward didn't know how to fix something. The power they influenced, the money, none of it mattered now. The silence pressed down, like guilt, heavy and alive. He poured a drink but didn't touch it. The glass just sat there collecting dust while he replayed. The moment in his head, her laugh, her calm voice, the way she said his name, like it meant something more than a headline. Somewhere out there, she was alone because of him. He opened his laptop and stared at the flood of messages. Harris had sent a draft statement for him to sign. Deny all allegations, reaffirm company values, express regret for any misunderstanding. He closed it. Regret wasn't enough. At 2 a.m, he drove again. No destination this time, just motion. The rain had stopped, but the streets still glistened, reflecting the glow of red lights and late-night diners. He stopped at a gas station, leaned against the hood, and lit a cigarette he didn't remember buying. The smoke burned, but it was something to feel. When his phone rang, he snatched it up instantly. Unknown number. "Sophie," he asked. There was a pause, then a voice. "This is Detective Morales, NYPD. Mr. Ward, do you know a Miss Sophie Carter?" His chest went cold. "Yes. Why, we found her apartment empty. No sign of forced entry. We're not calling this a disappearance yet, but—" The detective hesitated. "She left her phone behind." Alexander gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. "I'll find her," he said. "Sir, I advise you," but he'd already ended the call. He sat there for a long moment, eyes fixed on the horizon. For the first time in his life, he wasn't the one being hunted by headlines. He was the one chasing the truth. The billionaire everyone thought untouchable was now just a man soaked in rain and regret whispering into the night. Please be safe. The city kept moving. The world didn't stop for scandal. But somewhere beneath the noise, a promise formed he would find her, clear her name and face, whatever truth had started this fire. The night swallowed his car as he drove toward nothing. Headlights cutting through fog like a vow. Days bled together after the scandal. Alexander barely slept. His penthouse, once a fortress, now felt like a cage built from glass and guilt. Reporters still waited outside, but he no longer cared. What haunted him wasn't the headlines, it was her silence. Sophie had vanished completely. No trail, no trace, no message. And that silence spoke louder than any accusation. One night, unable to stand it anymore, Alexander opened the charity files his brother had left behind. The Ethan Ward Foundation. His brother's legacy was the only thing that still felt real. He had ignored it for months, delegating its operations to subordinates, while he drowned himself in work and isolation. Now he clicked through the records line by line until one name stopped him cold: Sophie Carter. Scholarship applicant rejected. He clicked open the details. Applicant: background art student, single caregiver to ill mother. Submission portfolio: windows of light. Evaluation denied due to funding cuts. The note in the margin was written by his former assistant, the one who had leaked the photo. Not suitable for brand alignment. Alexander's jaw clenched. He scrolled again and then froze. Attached was a scanned letter, one from his brother Ethan, written months before his death. "This girl's art reminds me of why we started this. Don't let the money people decide what deserves to be seen." At the bottom, a signature: Ethan's bold and alive. Alexander sat back. The air knocked from his lungs. Sophie had once been his brother's chosen artist. She hadn't just cleaned his floors, she had once painted for his foundation, a dream cut short by his own indifference. He shut the laptop, the truth hitting like a blow. He wasn't just the cause of her firing, had been the reason her dream died years before. He found her old portfolio online after hours of searching. The paintings were soft, intimate portraits of light, falling through dirty windows, or hands reaching across a table, or faces turned toward unseen warmth. One piece caught his breath: a man behind glass, half hidden by reflections. His eyes distant yet yearning. He didn't need a caption to know who it was. Ethan. And in the background, faint and blurred, another figure: himself. The truth felt heavy but clear now. His brother hadn't just seen Sophie's art, he'd seen her heart, and Alexander had crushed it without even realizing. He printed the letter, folded it into his pocket, and left. The city was quieter now, rain washed away by an early spring breeze. He drove through neighborhoods he hadn't visited in years until the skyline thinned and brick buildings replaced glass towers. Her address wasn't hard to find, just a faded nameplate near a cracked door in Queens. He stood outside, staring at it, wondering what kind of courage it took to knock. Then the door opened before he could. Sophie stood there. Her hair was pulled back, dark circles under her eyes. A jacket thrown loosely around her shoulders. She looked tired, but not broken. When she saw him, her expression didn't change, just quiet recognition. "You shouldn't be here," she said. "You shouldn't have disappeared," he replied. She exhaled, stepping outside and closing the door behind her. "You ruined my life, Alexander." "I know. Do you?" Her voice didn't rise, but it cut deep. "Because when your company fired me, it wasn't the first time you took something from me." She reached into her pocket, pulled out a crumpled rejection letter with the Ethan Ward Foundation header. "I kept it. I thought it was a mistake." "But it wasn't, was it?" He unfolded the paper from his own pocket, the letter from Ethan. "It was," he said softly, "but it wasn't yours." He handed her the page. She hesitated, then took it. Her eyes moved across the handwriting, the familiar signature. Her lips parted slightly. He wrote this: "Yes. My brother wanted you to have the scholarship. My office denied it after he died. I didn't even know your name then. And now I know what I destroyed." She looked up at him, pain and disbelief flickering in her eyes. "You're saying all this because you feel guilty." "Because it's true," he said, "and because I owe you more than an apology. You lost your art because of me. You lost your peace because of me. She turned away, arms crossed against the cold. You can't fix this. No, he said, but maybe I can try to make it mean something. She laughed softly, bitter and tired. You think money or words change what's been done? No, he admitted, but maybe truth can. The wind moved through the street, carrying the distant hum of traffic. For a long moment, neither spoke. Sophie finally looked at him, eyes bright but unreadable. You don't even remember what your company took from me, she said quietly. He shook his head. That's why I'm here, to remember. Her breath caught. It was the first time he had ever sounded small. Not powerful, not composed, just human. You can't erase what you did, she whispered. I'm not trying to erase it, he said. I'm trying to carry it. She looked down at the letter again. Ethan's words glowed faintly under the streetlight. He saw something in you, Alexander said softly. Something I never noticed until now. I'd like to see it too, if you'll let me. She folded the paper carefully, slipping it into her jacket. You think the truth fixes everything? No, he said, voice low. But it's the only place I can start. For a long moment their eyes held. Between them stood all the things they could not undo: pain, betrayal, years of silence. But somewhere inside that silence, something new took shape. Not forgiveness yet, but the beginning of understanding. When she finally spoke, her voice trembled slightly. Then start remembering. He nodded once the faintest trace of hope in his eyes. I will. As he turned to leave, she called after him. Alexander. He stopped, looking back. If you really want to remember, she said softly, then don't rebuild your name. Rebuild what he believed in. The wind rose, carrying her words like a vow. For the first time in years, Alexander Ward didn't feel hollow. He felt haunted but alive. The night was thick with storm clouds when Alexander returned to the penthouse. Rain streaked down the glass walls like tears that refused to stop. He hadn't been here since the scandal, since the day Sophie vanished. But tonight he needed to face what he had turned this place into: a shrine of silence, of guilt, of ghosts. The photo of his brother still sat on the table, the crack in the frame now spidering across Ethan's smile. Alexander set down his coat, poured nothing into a glass, and just stood there listening to the rain. Then came a sound, the elevator, a soft chime. His pulse stopped. When the doors opened, Sophie stepped out. She looked different, no uniform, no badge, just herself. Her hair damp from the rain, her eyes steady, as if she'd rehearsed this moment in her mind. Neither spoke. The storm outside filled the silence between them. Finally, Alexander said quietly, I didn't think you'd come. You sent the letter. She said simply, her voice calm but distant. You said you found something I needed to see. He nodded and picked up the worn envelope from the table, the one Ethan had written before he died. He left this in the foundation files. It was meant for you. He handed it to her. She opened it slowly, her fingers trembling. Inside, a single line, written in Ethan's familiar handwriting, for the artist who sees light in places I never dared to look. Sophie pressed her lips together, eyes glistening. He believed in me, she whispered. He believed in truth, Alexander said softly. And I buried both. His voice cracked. You were part of his dream, Sophie, and I killed it without even knowing. He took a breath, then met her gaze. But that's not the only truth I owe you. He turned toward the window, the same one where she'd found him months ago, kneeling and broken. Lightning flashed, illuminating his reflection. I destroyed everything my brother stood for. He wanted kindness. I built walls. He wanted honesty. I built lies, and when I met you, I saw what he saw the good he'd left behind, but I was too afraid to feel it. Sophie said nothing. Her breath caught in her throat. He turned back to her, voice unsteady. You made me remember who I was before all of this, before money, before headlines. But I hurt you anyway. I took what was beautiful and turned it into something ugly. You didn't take it, she said quietly. You just didn't protect it. He nodded, shame flickering through his eyes. You should hate me. I did, she admitted, for a long time. But hate doesn't last forever. It rots into something smaller, something sad. He swallowed hard, every word cutting deeper. You said once that silence doesn't answer anything. And it doesn't, she said. But sometimes silence is the only thing that keeps you from falling apart. He stepped closer, hesitating like a man at the edge of a confession too heavy to carry. Then let me fall apart, he whispered. We're alone now, Sophie. Time to tell the truth. She looked at him, the stormlight flickering in her eyes. Then tell me. He inhaled sharply, his voice breaking open. I loved my brother more than I ever said, and I hated him for being everything I wasn't. When he died, I blamed myself because I was driving that night. I thought success would make the guilt quieter, but it only made the silence louder. And then you came, and for the first time I wanted to be someone he'd be proud of again. Sophie's eyes filled. You don't have to earn his forgiveness, she said softly. He already gave it. Then what about yours? He asked, voice barely above a whisper. You can't ask for forgiveness for something that changed both of us, she said. But maybe we can stop pretending we're still broken. He took a step closer, the air between them, charged and fragile. You still care, he said quietly. Even after everything, caring doesn't stop just because it hurts, she said. You think I wanted to see your name everywhere? To hear people laugh about a story that wasn't true? You think I wanted to hate you? I tried, Alexander, but every time I remembered your eyes that night, when you couldn't breathe, I realized I was still trying to save you. His composure broke. He reached for her hand, stopping just short of touching. I don't deserve it. Maybe not, she said, tears in her eyes. But you deserve a chance to change. Outside, thunder rolled across the skyline. The world beyond the glass shimmered with reflected light. He finally reached out his fingers, brushing hers. The contact was barely there, but it felt like something sacred. Then help me rebuild, he said. Not my image, not my empire, just what's left of me. Sophie's lips trembled as she whispered, then start with truth. He nodded slowly. Truth, I thought I was saving you when I asked you to sit that night. But really you were saving me. Truth, she said softly. I never hated you. I hated myself for loving someone who made me feel small. Till I realized it wasn't love that made me small, it was fear. Their eyes locked, rain streaking the glass behind them like veins of silver. The storm outside quieted as if listening. He took her hand fully now, and she didn't pull away. Sophie, he whispered, his voice breaking. You were never supposed to be part of my story, but you became the only part that mattered. She leaned closer, her breath trembling. Then write it differently this time. And when he kissed her, it wasn't a grand moment. It was quiet, broken, real, the meeting of two people who had finally stopped hiding behind silence. The city lights flickered like stars trapped in glass as the truth between them finally found a voice. The weeks that followed were unlike anything Alexander Ward had ever lived through. For the first time, he wasn't chasing numbers or headlines. He was chasing purpose. After that night, Sophie didn't move back into his world of glass and power. She stayed in her small apartment in Queens, but their paths intertwined quietly, deliberately. Every morning she would find an envelope slipped under her door, blueprints, notes, ideas written in his sharp handwriting. At first she ignored them, thinking they were guilt wrapped in gestures, but one day a single line caught her eye. For Ethan's dream, not mine. The Ethan Ward Art Academy. That was the heading on the document. A plan to turn his late brother's name into a place of light again. An art school for underprivileged kids, funded entirely by Alexander's personal fortune. Sophie hesitated for days before showing up at the construction site, an old brick warehouse, bathed in dust and echoing emptiness. He was already there, sleeves rolled up, talking to workers, his hair tousled by the wind. When he saw her, he didn't smile, he just looked relieved. "I wasn't sure you'd come," he said quietly. "I wasn't sure you meant it," she replied. "Then help me prove it." And she did. Day by day, the skeleton of the building transformed into something that breathed. Sophie painted the walls herself, using colors that spoke of dawns and second chances. Alexander handled the logistics, selling off personal assets, liquidating properties, cutting ties with board members who called him insane. The press, hungry as ever, mocked his redemption act, but he didn't care. For the first time, he wasn't performing. He was healing. One afternoon, Sophie was standing on a ladder, painting a mural in the main hall. A pair of hands reaching toward each other, one covered in shadow, the other bathed in light. Alexander entered quietly, watching her work. "You gave this place a soul," he said. She turned a streak of blue paint on her cheek. "You gave it a reason to exist." He smiled faintly. "I just followed what Ethan wanted." "No," she said softly, climbing down. "You followed what he believed in." He looked around the hall, still smelling of fresh paint and hope. "I didn't think I could ever build something that didn't feel like a cage." "That's because you were building for yourself," she said. "This time you built for others." The first class opened 3 months later. Children filled the halls, laughing, drawing, painting with hands that didn't yet understand what privilege meant. Sophie stood in front of them as the lead instructor, her name on the door, Ms. Carter, art director. Alexander stood in the back, silent, proud. When she gave her opening talk about finding beauty in broken things, he saw her hand tremble just slightly, the way it had when she held his, the night of his confession. Afterward, when the crowd dispersed, she found him still standing there. "You didn't have to come," she said. "I did," he replied. "Because I needed to see what truth looks like when it finally breathes." They walked together down the hallway, stopping in front of the mural she had finished. The two hands joined now by a burst of light in between. Beneath it, a small inscription read, "For those who still believe in redemption." Sophie turned to him, her voice low. "You gave me back my dream." He looked at her emotion, tightening his throat. "You gave me back my soul." For a moment, everything was still, the faint sound of children's laughter echoing down the hall. Sunlight filtering through stained glass, painting the floor in gold. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small sketch folded in half. "Ethan's last drawing," he said, handing it to her. She unfolded it slowly. It was simple, 2 figures standing by a window, one painting, the other watching. "He drew this the week before the accident," Alexander said. He said it was about trust. Sophie traced the lines with her fingers, eyes glistening. "Maybe he was drawing what he hoped you'd find. Maybe he was drawing what I already had and didn't see." Outside cameras still tried to frame the narrative, The fallen billionaire rebuilds his name, they wrote, but inside none of that mattered. Redemption wasn't a headline. It was the quiet way Sophie wiped dust from a window, so light could fall on a child's easel. It was the way Alexander stayed late, helping hang art displays himself. It was the unspoken rhythm of two people who had stopped needing to justify why they still stood beside each other. One evening after the last student left, Sophie sat on the floor of the studio, her legs crossed, watching the sunset through the tall windows. Alexander entered carrying 2 cups of coffee. "Long day?" he asked. "A good one," she said. They finished their first exhibition piece. "What is it?" "A painting," she said, smiling faintly, "of a man standing in front of a mirror. But the reflection isn't him, it's someone kinder." "Clever," he murmured. "Honest," she corrected. He handed her the coffee, their fingers brushing. "You still talk like an artist," he said. "And you still listen like one," she replied. He sank to the floor beside her, the two of them framed by the last light of day. The academy around them hummed softly with the echoes of creativity and laughter. And for the first time, Alexander didn't feel haunted by the ghosts of what he'd lost. He felt anchored by what he'd rebuilt. "Ethan would have loved this," Sophie said quietly. "He'd say it's too much blue," Alexander replied, making her laugh. "Maybe," she said, "but he'd be proud." The laughter faded into a comfortable silence. He looked at her profile in the fading light, the streaks of paint on her fingers, the serenity in her eyes. "You once said silence doesn't answer anything," he murmured. "Now I think it just depends on who's in it with you." She smiled. Maybe that's the point. The light dimmed completely, and in that soft dusk the world finally felt balanced truth and forgiveness, loss and love all existing in the same breath. On the wall behind them, the mural of the 2 hands seemed to glow faintly under the last trace of sunlight, a silent promise that redemption once found never really fades. The night of the exhibition felt like a dream that neither of them could have imagined months ago. The Ethan Ward Art Academy was alive with light and sound, the scent of fresh paint and champagne filling the air. Guests in elegant clothes wandered the gallery, admiring the work of children who not long ago had never touched a canvas before. Reporters whispered about the man who had once been a billionaire, but now stood humbly in a charcoal suit. Watching from the background, Alexander didn't mingle, he observed. His gaze followed Sophie as she moved gracefully between the guests, answering questions about the paintings, smiling shyly when praised. She looked radiant in a simple cream dress, a paint stain still faintly visible on her wrist like a badge of truth. The exhibition was titled Silence and Truth. Alexander had resisted the name. At first it felt too personal, but Sophie insisted it was the only title that mattered. Near the center of the room hung the piece that caught everyone's attention, a large painting of a man sitting behind a glass wall, his reflection fractured by light, while a woman wiped the glass from the other side. The strokes were soft but deliberate, the colors merging into something hauntingly human. It was signed S. Carter. When Alexander approached, a journalist turned toward him. "Is it true you're the man in this painting?" He smiled faintly. "You'll have to ask the artist." Sophie appeared beside him at that moment, her voice gentle but sure. "It's not about him," she said. "It's about anyone who's ever hidden behind their own reflection." The journalist moved on, leaving the two of them standing together in front of the canvas. "Why that one?" Alexander asked quietly. "Because that's when I saw you," she replied. Not the billionaire, not the scandal, not the silence, just the man who couldn't breathe. He stared at the painting for a long time, and I saw the woman who wasn't afraid to touch the truth, he said softly. She looked at him, the flicker of emotion in her eyes breaking through the calm. Do you ever regret it? She asked. Oh, what we became, because of all that pain. No, he said, voice steady, because it's the only way I learned what love actually means. It isn't perfection. It's standing in the wreckage and choosing to rebuild anyway. The words hung between them, fragile and real. As the crowd applauded another piece, Sophie turned slightly toward him. You've changed, she whispered. I had to, he replied. Otherwise, all of this, the truth, the redemption, the silence, it would have meant nothing. And now she asked, now I just want to live without pretending. The lights dimmed as the event coordinator announced the final presentation. A spotlight illuminated a wall at the end of the gallery, where a new mural had been unveiled. Two silhouettes stood in a field of light, holding hands beneath an open window. Above them, words painted in silver read, "Truth is the only way out of silence." The room fell into quiet awe. Sophie's hand brushed against Alexander's. Did you write that? She whispered. No, he said softly. You did. The first day you spoke to me. She blinked, remembering. You mean when I said people like me aren't supposed to look at you, and I said, why not? He replied with a small smile. You looked anyway. Tears shimmered in her eyes, but she laughed through them. You remember everything now, don't you? Every moment that mattered, he said. As the applause resumed, he stepped back, letting her take the spotlight she had always deserved. When the event ended, most guests drifted out into the cool night air, leaving only the quiet hum of the gallery lights. Sophie stood before the mural one last time, arms folded, lost in thought. She didn't hear him approach until his reflection appeared beside hers in the glass. You stayed, he said. I wasn't ready to leave, she replied. Neither was I. They stood there in silence, the echoes of the evening settling into something tender. Outside, the city lights reflected on the windows, blurring the world into gold and blue. It feels like he's here tonight, she said finally. Ethan. He nodded. Every time I hear laughter in this place, I think maybe he forgave me long ago. He did, she said softly. And you've finally forgiven yourself. He turned to her eyes, tired but bright. Not completely. But I'm learning, she smiled. So am I. For a while they just stood there, two silhouettes framed by the art their pain had created. Then, without words, he reached into his pocket and pulled out something small, a key. What's this? She asked. The house by the coast, he said. It's quiet there, no press, no noise, just light and salt air. I've been restoring it. For you. For us, he said simply. If you still want to paint by the sea. She looked at him, her expression unreadable, then reached for the key. Their fingers brushed warm, steady, alive. We'll see, she whispered. Art takes time, so does forgiveness. Then maybe we'll build both. He smiled, the first real, unguarded smile she had ever seen from him. Together, she said. Outside rain began to fall, lightly soft and cleansing. He offered her his coat, but she shook her head. They walked out side by side, their reflections in the glass, merging one last time with the mural's painted silhouettes. The city around them glowed with quiet redemption, and for the first time, neither of them looked away. The house stood on the California coast, where cliffs met the endless blue of the Pacific, and mornings began in silence, except for the rhythm of the waves. A year had passed since the exhibition, and the Ethan Ward Art Academy had become a sanctuary for dreamers. Alexander and Sophie visited often, but this quiet cottage by the sea was home. It wasn't grand or polished. The walls bore traces of old paint, the windows framed by salt-streaked wood, and the air always smelled faintly of turpentine and coffee. Sophie had turned the sunroom into her studio. Every morning she would wake early barefoot, her hair still tangled from sleep, and move through the soft light spilling across the floorboards. The ocean's reflection danced across her canvas as she painted in silence, her brushed strokes deliberate, her heart unhurried. Alexander would appear a little later, still in his robe, carrying 2 mugs of coffee, one black one laced with cinnamon, just the way she liked. "You've been up since dawn again," he'd say, voice warm and low. "So have the waves," she'd reply, without looking up. He would smile, setting her cup on the table before opening the sliding doors to let the morning breeze in. The curtains fluttered like sails, and the sound of gulls carried through the air. He had grown different here, less like the man who had once owned the world, and more like the man who had finally learned to live in it. The sharpness in his voice had softened, his silences no longer hurt. He read again, repaired old furniture, planted herbs with more patience than he ever thought he had. Sometimes she'd find him sitting on the porch watching the sea, as if it were speaking directly to him. "Do you ever miss it?" she asked one afternoon while cleaning her brushes. "The city. The noise. I used to think silence meant failure," he said. "Now it just sounds like peace." She smiled. "You're getting poetic. You're rubbing off on me." Days turned into rhythms, paint, coffee, laughter, letters, from the academy evenings spent in the glow of candles instead of screens. They didn't need much. When the world remembered his name, it was for the right reasons now, but he no longer chased the headlines. He only cared about what was real, the art, the truth, and the woman who taught him both. One morning, as fog rolled over the cliffs, Sophie walked into the kitchen and found a note on the counter written in his familiar hand, "Follow the light." She frowned but smiled, stepping outside. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of salt and pine. Following the faint sound of music, she walked down the path to the small wooden shed he had rebuilt months earlier. Inside the space glowed with morning light, filtering through a glass roof. In the center stood a new easel, and beside it Alexander, holding a paintbrush awkwardly, like it was foreign territory. "What is this?" she asked, laughing softly. "My confession," he said. On the canvas she saw the beginnings of a painting, rough but tender. A woman standing by the sea, her face turned toward the light. "It's you," he said simply. "The way I see you." She blinked back tears, stepping closer. "It's beautiful, but you never told me you could paint." "I can't," he said with a small grin. "But you once told me art is just truth in color. So I figured it's time I told mine." She touched the wet edge of the canvas, her fingers trembling. "You're getting better at telling the truth," she whispered. "That's your fault," he teased softly. "You taught me that silence can heal, but only when it's shared." She turned toward him, her eyes luminous. "You rebuilt everything," she said. "The academy, your name, this house." "None of it matters," he interrupted. "This," he gestured around them. "This is what I wanted. A life with no lies, no noise, just truth." She smiled, brushing a stray lock of hair from his forehead. "Truth can be heavy. Then let's carry it together." They stood in quiet for a moment, the ocean murmuring beyond the glass. Then she whispered, "Do you remember the first thing you said to me?" He chuckled. Probably something arrogant. You asked why I never looked at you. He nodded slowly. And you said because people like me aren't supposed to. And now he asked, voice barely above a breath. She smiled, eyes glistening. Now I can't stop. He exhaled the kind of sigh that feels like coming home. They stayed like that, hands touching lightly, paint drying on the canvas, time moving softly around them. Later that evening, the sun bled into the horizon, staining the ocean gold. Sophie stood by the window, watching the light fade. Alexander came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. "We're alone again," she murmured. "Then let's tell the truth," he whispered against her hair. She turned to face him. "Which one? All of them," he said. "That I've loved you since the first time you told me to breathe. That every time I close my eyes, I still hear your voice saying I'm safe. That I never knew peace until you walked into my silence." She looked at him for a long moment before saying softly, "And my truth tell me that I loved you even when I shouldn't have. That I forgave you long before you asked. That I never stopped believing you could be better." His hands cupped her face gently, reverently. "You made me better," he whispered. They kissed slow and unhurried, the kind of kiss that doesn't need to prove anything. The world outside dimmed to a soft twilight, the waves keeping time with their hearts. When they pulled apart, Sophie looked at the wall beside them. There, hung above the table, was a framed piece of parchment, Ethan's handwriting preserved and worn. "Truth is what remains when everything else is gone." She traced the words with her fingers and smiled. "He was right," she said. "He usually was." They watched the last light fade from the sky. The house was quiet, but not empty. It was filled with the sound of brushes clinking, in jars the hum of wind through open windows, the faint laughter of two souls who had found their way out of the silence together. As night settled in, Sophie returned to her easel and began a new painting. Two figures standing in the glow of morning facing the sea. Alexander leaned against the doorway, watching her with quiet awe. "What will you call it?" he asked. She didn't look up, just smiled. The house with no silence. And as her brush moved across the canvas, the room filled with color and warmth, a testament to everything they had built from ruin love, born from honesty, peace, from pain, and a truth that would outlast them both. If this story touched you in some way, take a breath before you scroll. Think about how far honesty can carry two broken souls. How truth once spoken has the power to rebuild what silence once destroyed. Alexander and Sophie's journey isn't just about love. It's about redemption, about daring to face what we've buried for too long. Maybe you've been there too, standing by a window, wondering if anyone sees you for who you really are. Maybe you've had to unlearn what power means, or maybe you've been the quiet one, the one who heals others while forgetting yourself. This story is for you, for everyone who's ever been afraid to speak their truth, for everyone who stayed silent because love felt too heavy to carry. Remember, the people who truly belong in your life will never ask you to hide your heart. They'll ask you to tell your truth and stay. If you believe in that kind of love, the one that doesn't come with conditions or perfect endings, but with courage and honesty, then this story was meant to find you tonight. Share it with someone who still believes love can start again after the silence. Drop a comment below. Tell us what moment in this story stayed with you. Was it the night she told him to breathe? The day he rebuilt the academy? Or that final confession by the sea? Your words matter. They're part of this circle of healing. We're building one story at a time. And if you want more stories like this, cinematic, emotional, and real, don't forget to subscribe to Emma's Stories. Every week we explore new worlds where love redeems, where truth sets free, and where silence finally learns to speak. Because somewhere out there, someone needs to hear that they are not alone, that forgiveness still exists, that people can change, that love can survive even the darkest storms. So stay with us. Let's keep telling the stories that remind us who we are when the world forgets to listen. Comment your favorite line, tell us where you're watching from. And if you've ever had to choose between silence and truth, what did you choose? And if tonight's story made you feel something, even for a second, then don't let it end here. Rewatch it, share it, and remember, truth isn't the end of the story. It's where love begins.